In recent weeks, President Trump has signaled interest in the United States regaining access to Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, the strategic hub we abruptly abandoned in July 2021. On its face, this is about counterterrorism capability, restoring over-the-horizon capacity against ISIS-K, monitoring regional threats, and maintaining what some call strategic optionality in a volatile region. But the reality is far more complex. Any US re engagement with Afghanistan isn't simply a military question. It's deeply entangled with economics, regional power dynamics, and a web of competing interests that span from Beijing to Islamabad to the Gulf. Afghanistan sits on an estimated $1 to $3 trillion in untapped mineral wealth, rare earths, lithium, copper, resources that matter acutely in the context of US China competition. The Taliban, meanwhile, governs a country whose economy has contracted by nearly a third since 2020. $7 to $9 billion in Afghan reserves still frozen, mostly in US accounts. They need revenue. They need legitimacy. But they also face their own red lines, sovereignty, ideology, and the symbolism of having been defeated, or having defeated, the foreign occupation. So the question before us today is not simply can the United States and the Taliban find common ground? It's should the United States and the Taliban find common ground, and how can they do so, and what are the costs? Can economic incentives such as mineral development deals, sanctions relief, unfreezing reserves genuinely shift Taliban decision making, or are these mostly optics? And critically, what are the near-term risks that should be watched out for? Policy missteps, sanctions exposure, regional escalation, and what are the realistic mitigations? To help us navigate these questions, we have three exceptionally qualified experts. Dr. Marvin Weinbaum is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute and former US State Department analyst for Pakistan and Afghanistan, bringing decades of policy experience on security, governance, and regional strategy. Michael Kugelman directs the South Asia Institute at the Wilson Center and is one of the most prolific analysts on US, Pakistan, and Afghanistan affairs, with deep expertise in security dynamics and policy signaling. And Dr. Syed Mohammad Ali is a development anthropologist with extensive international development experience and is a lecturer at Johns Hopkins Global Security Studies Program and a weekly columnist for Pakistan's Express Tribune since 2011. We thank them all for giving us a crucial ground level experience. To start off with, Dr. Weinbaum, how realistic a premise was Trump's statement with regards to a US engagement with the Taliban concerning Bagram that we heard recently?
The larger issue here is engagement, whether the United States should have regular contacts with the Taliban, such as many countries now have developed. Only Russia has actual formal relations, but most of the major shareholder countries that really find that their interests are tied in with Afghanistan have already established, usually in the form of a consulate or an embassy, and they are in regular in contact. The United States, however, has not placed a single diplomat in Afghanistan since August of 2021. It's rather remarkable in that, considering that the US does have interests there. Counterterrorism, as you mentioned, there was the evacuation of American and then, of course, those who had allied themselves with the American occupation. So we do find an interest here, but the United States, for political reasons, as much as anything, and particularly around the issue of women's rights, finds it practically impossible to close those relations much as they've been. Now, what's curious about Bagram is actually Trump in his first term had a chance to get Bagram. We knew it was valuable. Our military had been very clear in saying we've got to keep a foothold there. We over the horizon sounds good, but it will be very difficult. We don't have the intelligence. We don't have the people on the ground who could direct such operations. So what happened was, in order to get an agreement in February of 2021, the U.S. dropped its insistence that it have a presence, a remaining presence. Now, why did it not go anywhere? And this is the important point. The Taliban have certain, and I'll have to bring in red lines here, have certain red lines. And one of those red lines has been, and it's not an Islamic one, but just as important for national reasons. And that is that when the Americans leave, that there are no foreign troops on the ground, no boots on the ground from the United States and other countries as well. And it's been a core belief here, even though there would be much, as you suggested, there would be much to gain here by relenting on that issue, compromising on that issue, as well as the women's issue. Even so, when it comes to certain beliefs, where the Taliban are an ideological regime, and they have really made it very clear that this is one of the anchors, really, of their policy, that we are now a sovereign country and we want no foreign influence in our country. So we had a chance to do that. We gave up on it. Now, suddenly, like Greenland, if you will, like Greenland, there was, we should have this. It really is in our interest, and let's get it. Greenland didn't go anywhere. I don't expect Bagram is going to go anywhere for the reasons I've already expressed. But it nevertheless is interesting because it shows a renewed concern for Afghanistan and a recognition that not having engagement with the country is not in American interests. And whether this leads to anything more, let me just say this. The United States can provide incentives for Afghanistan here. Above all, it could agree to recognize as a sovereign country. It could provide foreign assistance, especially since it's already taken out the humanitarian assistance, which was a major piece of American connectivity with Afghanistan. Right now, there are a number of things that the Taliban would want. But what is important about the Taliban is that they are not transactional. They have shown throughout negotiations that they don't bargain. When they have a principle, they stand by it. And this is what we're dealing with here now. And the United States could set up an embassy now, even without recognition. But even that may be a step too far for American public opinion. Let me stop on that.
Thank you, Marvin. I think following on from that, Michael, off the back of Dr. Weinbaum's comments with regards to red lines, I wonder if you had any comments on red lines that are material to Trump's recent comments vis-a-vis Bagram, or indeed the US's engagement with the Taliban.
Yeah, so thank you for including me. I appreciate the kind introduction. And just to clarify that, unfortunately, I'm former Wilson Center. I wish I were still there, but I'm former. To highlight some of the things that Marvin said, to go back to that, the point of engagement. The Taliban are not nearly as isolated now as they were back in the 90s when they controlled much of the country. And you've had senior U.S. officials meeting with Taliban reps in Qatar. And significantly, we've also had two different cases where a senior U.S. official in the Trump administration has traveled to Kabul and set foot in Kabul. And both times it was the U.S. hostage envoy, Adam Buller, as part of an effort to oversee what I view as the top U.S. objective, in Afghanistan in the Trump administration. That's to secure the release of remaining U.S. Hostages. So I think that's pretty significant, and I would argue that that actually qualifies as an informal form of legitimacy from the U.S. government to actually have its officials, or at least one of them, on the ground in Kabul with the Taliban in control. So to the issue of red lines. I think it's interesting that if you look at how the Taliban have evolved, at the moment when the Taliban came back in August 2021, there were some discussions, some very um, engrossing and at times heated debates about whether the Taliban have changed since they were in power in the 90s. And some people said they have because you look at how they're very different in terms of how they engage with technology. They're on social media. They're perfectly fine with photography. They engage with journalists and so on. And that's all true. But I think bottom line, fundamentally, and this gets to what Marvin was saying, they've had these core fundamental ideological views, and those have not at all changed. And of course, the issue of treatment of women, girls and women, that of course has not changed at all. That's very clear. And I think that the other big issue, I guess there are a number that one can refer to, but the one that we're hitting on today, this issue of foreign forces on Afghan soil, to me, that seems to be quite still very much rigid, set in stone. I have no reason to think that the Taliban would change their view on that. There had been some times, I don't remember the full details, but soon after the full foreign withdrawal in 2021, there were some discussions about working out some type of arrangement where you might have some foreign security forces, I believe from Turkey or maybe one of the Gulf states too, or not private security forces from other countries to be positioned at the Kabul airport. I don't think anything came of that. And there was a lot, I don't think anything happened with that at all. But that aside, I don't think there have been any cases that I know of. And of course, who knows what's really going on behind the scenes. No reason to think that the Taliban have been willing to make any concessions on that issue of red lines. And that brings up, I think, a troubling question for the Trump administration. Given that President Trump has on multiple occasions said that the U.S. should be given Bagram back, if the Taliban is not willing to do that, and I am quite sure that the Taliban is not willing to do that, what does the president do next if he thinks it still should be back in the hands of the U.S.? And I think that you have to look at some very ugly potential scenarios, presumably one that would involve the use of military force, given that the Trump administration wants to play less, not more of a role in the world. It claims to be opposed to any type of military operations or certainly military adventurism. To me, it would seem to make absolutely no sense at all. But I think the final point I'll make is why is President Trump so insistent that the U.S. needs this back, especially since one would think he'd have no interest in another U.S. foreign military base, given that he wants the U.S. to be less active in the region and more. His stated reason is that the Bagram is close to areas where China produces nuclear weapons. That's the only stated reason he's given. I do agree with this idea that there might be a counterterrorism angle to it, a view that is easier to monitor ISK if you're there. But I think that perhaps one of the real main reasons why the Trump administration would want to have a presence in Bagram relates to Iran. And this has not been mentioned publicly, but I suspect that the president and others would like to be in a better position to keep an eye on Iran, so to speak, which of course is very much in the proximity to the Bagram base. So, on the ISK issue, there's other ways that the U.S. can better pursue its counterterrorism objectives. We could talk about that than actually taking over a military base, because that would, and given all the complications that would cause. But I think I can leave things at that. But I think moving forward, the question to look at is: will Trump reiterate his demand once again, or is he going to move on? Because sometimes he has these fixations, but then he moves on, and he hasn't said anything about Bagram for at least I think a week or two now. Back to you.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Just off the back of that, Dr. Ali, what do you think the regional players themselves are thinking with regards to Trump's recent statements concerning Bagram and Afghanistan and Taliban in general?
Well, just his claim that he's going to be 1 hour away from where China is making nuclear bombs, which is not the case, right? I mean, a lot of those facilities are in central and eastern parts of China, significantly further from Bagram. Uh, it may be part of this larger posturing where the Department of Defense has now become the Department of War. But I think there's been walk back from within the US government as well, saying that, it will need something like an advanced deployment of 10,000 soldiers if it's going to be a military base again. So, that does not seem like a feasible suggestion. And it is quite interesting how the regional players are viewing this. So it would, besides sort of providing a foothold to the US in a region where there's proximity to Iran, proximity to China, and it might be important at a time where the Indo-Pacific contestation and the use of India in close proximity to China, is that kind of arrangement is also unraveling because of stress over tariffs and other issues. So I think in the last few hours, like Reuters just broke this story. So this kind of a very rare consensus by regional partners. So not directly talking about Bagram, but talking about sort of any deployment of military infrastructure in the country, foreign military infrastructure, is not something that that would be viewed favorably by India, Pakistan, Russia, China, Iran, Central Asian countries, right? The Moscow format of consultations, this post American withdrawal sort of regional engagement. So having a hard sort of Bagram Air Base as as it operated for those 15, 20 years during the American-led NATO intervention in Afghanistan is not going to be feasible. But are there, there's still questions around, could there be like some kind of a right mix of incentives, back channel diplomacy, willing elements within the Taliban, other regional players like Qatar, for instance, who could again play some kind of a role to enable. So right now, there's like in the Qatar diplomatic presence, that's the only way the US, because it doesn't have its own people on the ground, but there's a consular sort of kind of American interest section within the Qatar consulate in Kabul. I mean, there's the UAE, which is like sort of working with the airports. So could some of those regional actors with which the US does have relations, can they also, be involved in this process? And can it be, transactional in the same way that the American president has, offered Ukraine that deal, right, for critical minerals, because there's a lot of lithium. That's what China is also doing. So that could be a possibility, but but there are also challenges to this. Even at home, with the kind of backing that the current president enjoys, this kind of expansionist footprint is not something that's favorable. The Taliban doubling down on sort of, and walking back from their earlier positions on Afghan women. I mean, of course, the way that the peace deal was signed was also quite disappointing, right? And that sort of that entire framing of trying to save Afghan women, not from a policy position, but from more critical lenses, was this kind of typical strategy of, of creating a rationale for the just war. Which, I mean, in colonial context has also been about like saving brown women from brown men, as Leila Abu Lughad termed this. So, I don't know how, with the current regime and, the American public sentiment, which is already, I mean, you also see amongst the conservatives, this kind of disdain for, America now being dragged into the situation in the Middle East. So, there are, there are incentives, there are possibilities, and, there are people within the US establishment who feel that the Taliban are now a reality and they need to be dealt with. But then there are also these constraints. So it'll be interesting. It's an interesting space to watch and see what happens within it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ali. I think we've kind of all three of you have identified this tension point between ideology and potential economic incentive. In particular, to hone in on your point on all of your points on rare earth and general minerals, Afghanistan holds an estimated $1 to $3 trillion in untapped mineral wealth. We're talking here rare earth elements, lithium, copper, iron, gold. And the premise here is that the US has minimal direct interest in extraction as opposed to China, but has an acute interest in preventing China from monopolizing these rare earths. Simultaneously, the Taliban needs revenue desperately, as its economy has contracted at around 30% post 2021, notwithstanding the AIDS cutoff. So, to what extent is this a potential lever in terms of the US or Western development finance for mineral extraction in exchange for, say, security cooperation through, even though the sanctions regime may make this complex? And I framed that question with specific thoughts with regards to the TAPI pipeline, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, as well as the Belt and Road. I wonder, Michael, if you have any comments of that to start with, but this is an open question for any of you to answer with your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, first point is that the Taliban, going back a number of years, back before they came back to power, have indicated that they support infrastructure projects so long as they support national goals or something like that. So, this is why the Taliban have not rejected TAPI, and the Taliban, in principle, are not opposed to Belt and Road activities inside Afghanistan. I think from a U.S. angle, there's just not that much interest in Afghanistan at the end of the day. And yeah, I mean, the critical minerals may seem tempting, but for the administration, there's a lot more interest in critical minerals in Pakistan now than there is in Afghanistan for reasons that I think we can understand. As I said before, the main U.S. goal in Afghanistan is securing the remaining U.S. hostages. Beyond that, there certainly is interest and also concern about the issue of ISK, which, from Washington's perspective, poses a much greater threat to U.S. interest and potentially the U.S. homeland than perhaps any other global terrorist group. And this is, of course, ISK is the Afghanistan and Pakistan-based faction of the wider Islamic State. So there is going to be that interest. But I mean, the fact that the U.S. worries about security concerns in Afghanistan, ISK has been projecting a threat well beyond Afghanistan, but it carries out attacks in Afghanistan as well. That in of itself, I think, would really discourage the U.S. and, quite frankly, many other countries from wanting to look into these rare earth possibilities in Afghanistan. And here I'll come to what I think is a fundamental point to make about the geopolitics of Afghanistan in recent years. China has been singled out as the one country that's been really keen to make some progress in making investments in big spaces in Afghanistan, whether you're talking about infrastructure projects or critical minerals. China, of course, has this copper mine project, but China has not really been doing much in Afghanistan. There was an energy deal that it concluded with a Chinese company concluded an energy deal with the Taliban soon after the Taliban came back to power, but that deal is no longer in effect. So I think that even those countries that one might think or those countries that might signal a desire to get involved in these activities, they're being very careful and very cautious. And in the case of China, and for that matter, Russia, not necessarily because of being uncomfortable about working with the Taliban. That's not the issue. Though certainly there is the question of what capacity does the Taliban have to work with external players on these issues. Main reasons why I think Russia extended formal relations with the Taliban was to be in a better position to address those terrorism concerns. ISK has, of course, targeted Moscow in recent years. So anyway, short answer to your question is that I'm not very sanguine about I'm not very bullish about this idea of countries in the region and more broadly looking to Afghanistan in terms of rare earths critical minerals. I just think that the Trump administration and others are more interested in looking at other places than Afghanistan right now.
Dr. Ali, go ahead.
So, two interesting things. I mean, one there, one's just heard of, America possibly being given also a foothold in Balochistan, in Pasni, right? And there's analysts within the country are saying, hey, this will not be too good an idea, but sort of there is this kind of reinvigoration of, the top military brass and, the sheriffs who are themselves quite beholden to sort of the military establishment trying to mend fences with the US. So I don't know how, how much traction is behind, providing a natural foothold, to the US. And Pasni is like, it's a stone's throw away from Gwadar itself. So that's just speculation at the point, but there has been this announcement of a $500 million investment, potential American investment in critical minerals. And it got me a little excited because, a lot of this artisanal mining in Balochistan, in the same way in the DRC, you see the horrors of trying to, mine for renewables and the child labor and the sort of despondency and deprivation you see around that process. And, Balochistan's also kind of no man's land in that sense. And I mean, the Chinese have been there now increasingly since CPEC. But of course, I mean, US aid had also been there for decades, not really doing a lot of participatory development. But still, in terms of mining regulations, sort of good governance around mining, whatever infrastructures had been developed with those processes, it would have been very interesting to see some of that actually come into Balochistan, because China's already in Las Bela and other places, and there is potential, copper, zinc, and other things. But Balochistan is very disgruntled because it feels that the rest of the state is quite hegemonic and doesn't share the wealth, and Pakistan has not learned the lesson from Bangladesh. And there's restiveness in Balochistan, and it's a kind of a resource curse. And from what indications I've seen and what I've heard, the current US plans are not, thinking of trying to improve governance and, address ecological concerns around critical mining. It's more about creating blockchains. So it's a very top-down crypto, who knows who, money to be made quickly, and that model does not percolate. It does not trickle down. So, there isn't a lot there yet. I mean, let's see what processes are articulated. But the early indications from what I have, heard have been a bit disappointing.
Dr. Weinbaum.
Yes, we've heard mention Pakistan several times. I think Pakistan has to be brought into this more centrally. Pakistan is, in terms of the security arrangements for the region, we're really talking about Pakistan and not Afghanistan. Afghanistan is really an outlier and will remain so for logistical reasons, for the very nature of the state. But Pakistan, there's been a major change now during the Trump administration. It is that Pakistan has, in a sense, reclaimed what it had in the Cold War, during the jihad, and even more recently. And that is where it served as a strategic partner, security partner for the United States. During the Biden administration, there was really a disdain for anything with regard to Pakistan, and minimal interest in the country as such, for what it had been in some ways, and continues to be duplicitous. But now what we're seeing here is the way in which the United States is cultivating its relationship with Pakistan. And as part of this, Pakistan is emerging as a major player here now for the United States, and this strategic ally that the United States is trying to groom in Pakistan, I think is so important, particularly given the developments in the Gulf now, and specifically the security arrangement now between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, where we may be seeing a restructuring of the security architecture for the region. And I don't see Afghanistan playing a part in this, where it will even involve countries beyond Pakistan and Afghanistan, and who might see what is happening in between those two countries as a template for a closer strategic agreement, arrangement particularly for the Arab and Islamic countries. So I think now much of the discussion and following from what we've been talking about has been this transactional, that you've got the minerals, we've got an interest in them, but it goes well beyond that. As I say, there are bigger stakes here now, and the United States looks at the pact between Saudi Arabia, and actually not as something which is competing, but rather which complements its arrangements with the Gulf countries and also its own interests. And we could also mention India in this context as well, because India has receded from the role it has played for a long time now, where it was an anchor of American security policy in South Asia, particularly against China. Now, Pakistan is not going to be pitted against China for certain, but maybe purely out of personal whim on the part of feeling that he's been disrespected. President Trump now has alienated a great many people in India. I don't think that the U.S.-India relationship is going to somehow become minimal, but it's because two countries do need one another economically. But at the same time, Pakistan is emerging here in India's stead, and I believe that this is something to watch now. And we have to remember this: Pakistan has the largest military in the region. It has the largest population in the region, and it is the only country, Islamic country, that has nuclear weapons. So Pakistan has been undervalued there for its strength in those regards. And let me conclude by saying, but Pakistan also has weaknesses. Pakistan's economy is not the kind of economy that can support a major actor in the region. Pakistan is experiencing a resurgence here of an insurgency led by the TTP, but also one in which Islamic State is facing, is also in the picture. And for these three reasons, as important as Pakistan wants to see itself and be treated as a major player in the region, it has to overcome these handicaps. So let me stop there.
Thank you. In terms of actually honing into whether, with regards to the Taliban themselves, economic sweeteners could actually shift decisions. I mean, it's not unheard of for that to make a difference in regimes, for want of a better word, that have had quite stringent ideologies. And historical precedents, for example, takes into account Libya's Gaddafi, which traded weapons of mass destruction, the WMD program for economic normalization. On the other hand, we do have a very rigid and very very set in stone idea, as far as we know, about women's rights and Sharia governance. In terms of the reliability of the stringency of that ideology, to what extent can there be incremental steps taken for economic sweeteners to actually shift decisions? Or is this something which is just going to be one of those red lines that just can't be crossed? And I'll pose that question, I think, to start off with, to you, Dr. Weinbaum.
As I think we've already discussed here now, if we're talking about the Taliban, that these run into these red lines. I believe here that we should not be focusing as much as we are on Afghanistan. I don't see Afghanistan changing over the next 5 years. And as far as the extraction of its mineral wealth, that's going to always be something with promise. Promise is always going to be out ahead, not delivery. What Afghanistan lacks is the infrastructure that would be necessary for it to capitalize on the mineral wealth that it has. But even there, Pakistan lacks the human capital such that any investments in there have to bring in foreign workers if they are really to progress. We have to look at projects like the TTP, the pipe from Turkmenistan. That's been always in the promised stage and never really followed through. So to my mind, Afghanistan is going to be a marginal player here now, and we should keep our eye on the region and in the way in which it's going to envelop large parts of the Islamic world, but also Central Asia as well is going to come into this. China will be an active player here, but the Chinese are not investing if they feel that it's going to be simply a grant without return. China is very conscious of the economic incentives that a country has to offer. And as Michael has pointed out here, they have really not followed through. So I'll leave it to others to further discuss this.
I'll open the floor to others discuss it, and perhaps also to tie in any closing remarks you might have over the topics in general.
I'm happy to weigh in briefly. Agree with Marvin. I think there's this much discussed. I don't want to say a split, but you have two different groupings of the Taliban leadership, right? You've got the supreme leadership, which is based in Kandahar. That's where the supreme leader is based. And then you have the political leadership, which is based in Kabul. And there's a lot of discussion about how the supreme leadership is relatively more hardline and ideological than the political leadership. Though I never would feel comfortable describing a member of the Haqqani network who happens to be in power as moderate. It's all very relative, of course. But getting to the issue that was brought up before, the supreme leadership has the final say on the big decisions, on the big policy decisions, and they don't make any exceptions on the ideological issues, the issue of women's rights and so on. But when it comes to some of the policy issues, the temporal policy issues that don't relate to religion, it essentially is willing to defer to the political leadership. And the political leadership is really that part of the Taliban that does what it can to secure some level of international legitimacy and try to secure formal recognition from as many countries as it can. I mean, the Taliban want to do that, and clearly the supreme leadership are not opposed to that. Otherwise, you would not have these, high level, these significant, frequent engagements between Taliban leaders, which of course are always from the political leadership, and diplomats from around the world, including from the West, and even a country like India, which many would not have necessarily expected to have a relationship with the Taliban, but indeed, we've had pretty high level engagements between Taliban officials and Indian officials. So yeah, and so my bottom line in terms of concluding comments, to come back to what I said before. And I would agree with this gets to a point that Marvin made as well. Afghanistan is not viewed as a really significant strategic player. I think it's not really going to be very involved in a lot of these geo-economic discussions about critical minerals, that type of thing. The Trump administration doesn't really think that much about Afghanistan, quite frankly. But it matters just because of geography, right? I mean, we know where Afghanistan sits. It's a crossroads to a number of very critical regions. Someone mentioned Central Asia. That's essential. We don't talk enough about Central Asia. You look at Pakistan, how it's trying to pursue connectivity projects into Afghanistan and further more into Central Asia. India is trying to deepen its engagement with Central Asia. A lot of critical minerals there. So the Trump administration is now very focused on Central Asia. So because of its location, for Afghanistan as a bridge to the Middle East, a bridge to South Asia, to Central Asia, that means that it'll have to be seen as strategically significant. But obviously the realities of Afghanistan, those that are in charge, the security concerns, obviously the economic distress is going to make it very difficult for Afghanistan to have the type of agency that some might like it to have to play more of a role in these developments.
Thank you, Michael. Dr. Ali.
So I think that in the counter-terrorism realm, I mean, one common denominator for everyone is the Islamic State in the Khorasan chapter, because be it China, be it India, be it Pakistan, be it Iran, be it the Taliban themselves. I mean, one of the reasons ascribed to their sort of hardline stance and doubling down on sort of Pashtun majoritarianism is the fear of attrition, has been the fear of attrition, because now the Islamic State has been posing itself as the new, resistance movement and portraying the Taliban as being complicit. So, I think some of this has been difficult because there are other proxy actors, who do cross-border stuff where there isn't consensus. I mean, be it ETIM, be it the BLA, be it the TTP, where regional actors don't see eye to eye. I mean, India and Pakistan, for instance. So, that this is one area of concern, because in that political vacuum, in that, stress be Afghanistan, even if it's not important, it can become, again, a source of friction for not only the region, but beyond. Because this is a global jihadi outfit. And on the other hand, I mean, one's all for sort of cooperation, regional cooperation. But again, there have been blockages there. Like, remember HIPPI, the India, Pakistan, Iran pipeline. And, then India dropped out as it had a nuclear arrangement with the US. Then it was Pakistan and Iran, and Pakistan's like facing stress because it might be sued internationally, but it fears American sanctions. And water is going to be a big issue. Like, if you look at the Kabul River and its S-shape, coming in and out of Pakistan, being upper riparian and lower riparian, then the Indus water, issue, which of course a lot of those waters come, from Tibet, another contested area. So, I mean, if there's trade, if there's regional harmony, and and if there isn't, maximalist positioning, be it like, vis-a-vis great power competition, and there's common ground found, like in climate, building climate resilience, etc. There's a lot of potential. But, at the same time, I think I've also identified, some of the hurdles in that process that need to also be considered.
Marvin, as I've given Michael and Dr. Ali, time for closing statements. Are there any closing pieces that you'd like to add?
Just, I would mention, it's interesting how the Middle East was supposed to take a back seat in American policy to the Asia Pacific area. What we have seen recently now is the United States being drawn back into the region, very much into the region, becoming not a partner in every sense, but finding that it has not only interest in the Levant, Palestine, but that it has a general important stake here in what happens in the region. And it is an interesting development, considering where everyone thought American interests were going to move. And it's one which I don't know that the United States is really prepared for. It's very clear here that American policy now is being driven in large part by the initiatives that the president wants to take, and that the foreign policy establishment, which for the United States was so important for so long, is ill prepared for this role that I'm now suggesting the United States is taking on for itself to become a more actively engaged in the region. And so it will be interesting how this works out. But I'll conclude with the fact that what we have to deal with is the fact that American policy is very mercurial at this point. As much as I've said that this is the trend, it's very easy for the current American government to, if you want to use it, wipe its hands of this and that, or at least try to. So it's a very dynamic situation. And in many ways, I don't think that the United States is well prepared to take on the role that it is finding itself being responsible for.
Thank you. What's emerged clearly from this conversation is that there are no clean solutions here, only difficult trade-offs. The United States faces a fundamental tension, which it is arguably ill prepared for. It has legitimate security interests in Afghanistan, counterterrorism, strategic monitoring, denying space to its competitors, but virtually every pathway to advancing those interests involves costs that have historically proven unacceptable, whether that's tacit legitimization of Taliban rule, acceptance of their governance model, or dependence on arguably unreliable intermediaries. Now, what was particularly striking in this exchange was the convergence around several key points. First, that Pakistan remains quite central to any conceivable US-Taliban arrangement, yet Pakistan itself is increasingly unstable and caught between competing pressures. Second, that while economic leverage exists, ideology and internal Taliban politics may prove more determinative than dollars. And third, that the regional context has perhaps shifted more than Washington may care for or indeed realizes. China, the Gulf states, and even Central Asian neighbors are already making their own accommodations with Kabul, which means the window for US influence may be narrower than assumed. So where does that leave the policy community? The collective analysis suggests that if the US proceeds, and that remains a significant if, it intends to do so with extraordinary discipline. Narrow, verifiable, and reversible arrangements, multilateral frameworks, for example, include purely bilateral deals or clear-eyed recognition of dealing with an ideologically driven actor, not simply a rational economic one. Most importantly, mechanisms that prevent the normalization of Taliban governance without meaningful progress on human rights, particularly for women and girls. Now, the Trump administration's signaling on Bagram may be an opening gambit, a negotiating position, or simply rhetorical flourish to a country that practically does not pose in reality an immediate priority. Well, that remains to be seen. But what this discussion has made clear is that whatever comes next will require navigating one of the most complex geopolitical puzzles of the current era, in a region where American leverage is limited, its partners are unreliable, and its adversaries are patient. Thank you very much to our three exceptional panelists, Dr. Weinbaum, Michael, and Dr. Ali, for your expertise, your candor, and your willingness to wrestle with questions that don't have easy answers.